Welcome to my next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to catch more amazing stories. On an autumn evening, the cold air filled the deserted streets of the small town. Officer James Harlow, a white man with over 15 years of experience in law enforcement, drove his patrol car through the narrow streets with a focused gaze. He was always proud of his work, but deep down, James harbored prejudices he had never fully recognized. These racial biases, though never explicitly expressed, simmered beneath the surface, casting a shadow over the way he saw the world. The patrol car slowly moved through the neighborhoods, its flashing lights illuminating damp walls and closed shops. In James' sight, a luxurious black car appeared at the intersection ahead. Such a car did not belong to an ordinary resident of this town, which made James feel suspicious. He decided to turn on the signal light and ordered the car to pull over. The driver of the black car slowly pulled over to the side of the road. As James stepped out of his vehicle, his heart pounded not out of nervousness, but out of an unprovoked anger. In his mind, cars like that should never belong to a black person. He approached the car window, hand resting on his gun, ready to deal with any situation. "Roll down your window, now," James commanded in a stern tone. The window slowly rolled down, and James saw a black man sitting behind the wheel. The man wore a neat suit, his face calm but his eyes showing a hint of confusion. He calmly raised his hands to show that he was unarmed, a familiar gesture that black people often had to make to avoid misunderstanding by the police. "What did I do wrong, officer?" the man asked calmly. But James ignored the politeness. In his mind, the prejudice against a black man driving a luxury car overpowered fairness and reason. "License and registration?" James snapped, his eyes full of suspicion. The man remained silent for a moment, then opened the glove compartment and took out the car papers. Along with his ID, James took them and glanced at them, but immediately felt like he had been struck by lightning. On the ID was the name David Carter, and below it, the title, Police Chief. James froze, shock and embarrassment enveloping him. He looked back at the man in front of him, the person whom, just seconds ago, he had thought was a potential criminal. The new police chief had just moved to town, and James had made the biggest mistake of his career. I'm sorry, Chief," James stammered, his voice suddenly losing its sternness. He quickly handed back the papers, feeling the weight of regret on his shoulders. David Carter looked at him, his eyes showing no anger, but instead a strange understanding. "You're just doing your job, Officer Harlow, but I think we need to have a talk about treating people fairly." James bowed his head, not knowing what else to say. He realized that he had made an unforgivable mistake, and it would not only affect his career but also change the way he viewed himself and his work. Immediately after David Carter presented his identification, James was still confused and not entirely convinced by what he had just seen, partly because of the shock, partly because of the lingering prejudices in his heart. James continued to call for backup over the radio. Within minutes, another patrol car arrived at the scene, with two young officers stepping out. Following James' request, James turned back to David and said, "Please step out of the vehicle, sir." David did not want to escalate the situation, so he complied, opening the car door and stepping out with his hands raised. The newly arrived officers saw the situation and immediately approached with caution. They looked to James for instructions. "Take him to the side and perform a security check," James ordered, trying to conceal the uncertainty in his voice. One of the young officers approached and began to frisk David, asking him to turn toward the car and place his hands on the roof. David did not resist, but his eyes showed clear disappointment. "Officer, I think you're making a mistake," David said calmly. "I am the new police chief of this town." The young officer paused, turning to look at James with a questioning expression. James felt the tension in the air, and he began to realize that the situation was becoming much more complicated than he had anticipated. However, James still signaled to continue the check. and David was asked to sit on the curb while they verified his car papers and information through the system. The waiting time felt endless. David sat on the sidewalk, his suit dirted by the dust and soil. He looked down the road, his eyes tinged with sadness but without a trace of anger. He knew that this situation was not just a personal misunderstanding, but a testament to what he had faced throughout his life: prejudices and suspicions simply because of the color of his skin. When the information finally appeared on the screen, the young officers looked at each other, then at James with astonishment and hesitation. "He really is the police chief, sir," one of them said, voice trembling. James felt as if the ground beneath him was collapsing. He knew he had gone too far, and now there was no immediate way to rectify his mistake. He walked over to David, extending a hand to help him up. I truly apologize, Chief. I made a mistake." David took James' hand and stood up, brushing the dirt off his clothes. He remained silent for a moment, looking James straight in the eyes. "You did what you thought was right, but sometimes we need to look deeper within ourselves to understand what is truly just." James bowed his head, not knowing what else to say. He felt deep regret, but at the same time, he also recognized an important lesson that he needed to learn. This was not just about apologizing, but about changing the way he viewed the world, changing to become a better police officer, and more importantly, a better human being. David returned to his car, but before leaving, he added, "We'll meet again at the station tomorrow, Officer Harlow. I think we have much to discuss." James stood there, watching the black car drive away, feeling the heavy weight in his chest. That night, he continued his patrol, but his mind couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He knew that the meeting with David tomorrow would be the first step in his journey of change, and he was willing to face it, no matter how difficult it might be. The next day, the story of the encounter between James and the new police chief spread throughout the station. Everyone was talking about it, and James became the center of unwanted attention. He felt isolated, and the shame prevented him from looking his colleagues in the eye. David Carter, the new police chief, did not publicly criticize James, but he decided to hold a meeting with all the officers to discuss prejudice and racism within the force. The meeting was not just for education but also to change the mindset of everyone, including James. During the meeting, David did not directly mention the previous night's incident, but he shared stories from his past: the times he was treated unfairly by police simply because of his skin color, the times he had to prove he was not a threat, and the times he had to teach his children how to behave when pulled over by the police to ensure their safety. James sat in the corner of the room, listening to every word the chief said. Each of David's stories felt like a punch to his pride, making him realize that the prejudice he unconsciously carried was not only wrong but also deeply hurtful to innocent people. He began to understand that his duty was not just to protect the community but also to protect fairness and the trust of the people in law enforcement. After the meeting, James decided to speak privately with David. He knew that an apology was not enough, but he wanted to show his remorse and was eager to learn how to change. David agreed to meet with James after work, and they had a long conversation in the chief's office. David was not only a strict leader but also a compassionate person. He listened as James admitted his mistakes and shared about his upbringing, where prejudices had been instilled from a young age. David understood that change did not happen overnight, and he was willing to help James on that journey. James began attending diversity and inclusion workshops, not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to change. He also participated in community activities, meeting and talking with people whom he once thought he could never understand. Through each meeting, each story, he gradually realized that differences in skin color and background were only superficial, while deep down, everyone shared the same dreams, fears, and love. Over time, James gradually became a new person. He was no longer the officer with unconscious biases but became a reliable colleague, someone whom everyone in the community felt safe encountering. The story of James' transformation spread, and he began to earn respect from both his colleagues and the townspeople. One day, James was invited to a community event to honor individuals who had made positive contributions to the town. At the event, David Carter stood up to speak. He recounted the story of his first encounter with James. But this time, he did not tell it as a story of prejudice but as a story of change and hope. "We all make mistakes," David said. "But what matters is that we learn from those mistakes and change to become better versions of ourselves. James Harlow has done that, and he is proof that anyone can change if they have the courage and sincerity." James stood up, his eyes welling with tears. He stepped onto the stage, looked at David, and said, "Thank you, Chief. Thank you for giving me a second chance. And thank you for showing me that justice is not just about enforcing the law, but also about fairness and compassion." Applause filled the hall, and in that moment, James felt he had found redemption. He had not only redeemed himself from his wrongful prejudices but had also found a new path, a path of justice, love, and hope.